After producing a video about fake quotes that circulate around that are attributed to Aristotle, I asked people who they would like to see me tackle next, and it was overwhelming in all the polls that I did. Plato. So as it turns out, there's a lot of fake Plato quotes out there, sometimes attributed directly to Plato, sometimes to Socrates, since Socrates is a major character in Plato's dialogues, and there's lots and lots of them circulating around. So I just picked 10 of them that I thought were particularly interesting or problematic or egregious, and we're going to go through each of these, and I'll tell you where it comes from when we do know that, and also why this isn't likely something that Plato would have said in most cases. So, with no further ado, let's look at our very first one. Now, this is not a terrible thing to say, but it's just not by Plato. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. It's not just attributed, by the way, to Plato, but also to Philo of Alexandria, but it's not from either of them. It is actually from this Scottish preacher, Ian McLaren, back in the close to the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and then it gets picked up by a whole bunch of people. For example, Dan Millman in No Ordinary Moments, A Peaceful Warrior's Guide to Daily Life. And we see this happening from the 1990s onward, lots and lots of people uncritically taking a quote like this that they think perhaps came from Plato, but they haven't actually read any Plato. Now, why would Plato probably not have said this? This be kind is not a common locution in Greek texts. You know, you could say something, maybe translate like be benevolent to people, do good to other people. And this notion everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle, that's pretty new agey, even though it's going back quite a ways. So it's not something that Plato says anything like in his works. Let's look at the next one now. This is also an interesting saying. Watch a man at play for an hour and you can learn more about him than in talking to him for a year. Now, this is something that Plato would never have said because talking is in general the way that you learn about people in the Platonic dialogues. And you could say something like, well, watch a person's actions and you'll learn a lot about them. But watching them at play, probably not. This is actually a paraphrase of a statement which is in a work by Richard Lindgaard in a letter of advice to a young gentleman leaving the university concerning his behavior and conversation in the world, 1907. So, that's when people said wordy stuff like that. And it says here, if you would read a man's disposition, see him game, then you will learn more of him in 1 hour than in 7 years' conversation, and little wagers will try him as soon as great stakes, for then he is off his guard. Again, this shows up in later literature. It gets attributed to Plato in a 1987 book by Alan Loy McGuinness, Plato in Confidence, How to Succeed in Being Yourself, but he's taking it from somebody else and attributing it to Plato. And then from that point on, it's out there and people will think that it is indeed Plato. Let's look at the next one now. Wise men talk because they have something to say, fools because they would like to say something, or they have to say something. There's variations on it. The quote sometimes continues as empty vessels make the loudest sound, so they that have the least wit are the greatest babblers. Not in this particular one that we've got imaged here. And notice, this is really quite something here. It's not just attributing it to Plato, philosopher, but Plato, philosopher and historian. It's rather unusual to see Plato called a historian. So there's kind of a double mix-up here. Now, where is this actually coming from? There's two early 20th century works in which we can find this attributed to Plato, even though it's not from Plato's texts. One of these is the 1903 book by Abraham Coleman, Proverbial Wisdom, Proverbs, Maxims, and Ethical Sentences of Interest to All Kinds of Men. And then then there's also the Tyrone Edwards book in 1908, A Dictionary of Thoughts, being a cyclopedia of laconic quotations from the best authors of the world, both ancient and modern. So they both managed to get it mixed up. Perhaps Edwards drew from Coleman. We're not really quite sure, but there may have been a source text earlier that we don't have. This next one is very interesting. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. Not by Plato. You're not going to find this anywhere in his text. We do find something kind of like this in Seneca, who is talking about Lucretius, a Epicurean author who's a little bit before him, saying we are as much afraid in the light as children in the dark. So that could be a possible source of it, but we're not exactly sure where this comes from. There's a lot of reworking going on if it's actually the working off of the Seneca piece. It's definitely not by Plato, though. Now, here's an interesting one that actually has some variants floating around. Music is a moral law. It gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, charm to sadness, gaiety, and life to everything. And you notice that this particular instance of it doesn't have exactly that formulation. I think people are monkeying around with it a bit. There's also a variation out there. Books give a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. So we know that that one is probably coming from this earlier one claiming that music is the moral law. And this is not by Plato. This is actually by a guy, John Lubbock, who has a whole bunch of different attributions, principal of the London Workingmen's College, president of the London Chamber of Commerce, etc., etc., published in 1889 in his Pleasures of Life, Part 2. And now you could say, well, wait a second, Plato loved music and, he did have a cosmological sort of view on things. Couldn't this be by him? Yes and no. He wouldn't have called it a moral law. Plato thought that music could be used for good or for bad. If you want to check that out, look in, the Republic, where he discusses various modes of music and their good and bad effects on people. And it's not music itself that does all of these things that are being attributed to it, giving soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination. No, that's going a little bit too far, although music is important. I think you can kind of tell right off the bat that this is not going to be by Plato, in part because, they did have terms that would correspond to meaning, like the meaning of a word or the meaning of a term, but this notion of meaning of life is a little bit foreign. There's lots of Greek terminology talking about like the purpose of life or the point of life, telos. There's, what we value in life, what we consider important, the kind of lives that we choose. But the meaning of life is not something that we're really going to see in ancient philosophy, and particularly in Plato. And as it turns out, this comes from two 20th century sources, both of which are talking about Plato, but reformulating matters. So Ernst Cassirer, great philosopher, writes in his 1944 an essay on man. What is man? Man is declared to be that creature who is constantly in search of himself, a creature who in every moment of his existence must examine and scrutinize the conditions of his existence. He then quotes, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Abraham Joshua Heschel in 1954 is quoting Cassirer and then introducing some further considerations. He says, nowhere in Plato's Socratic dialogues do we find a direct solution to the problem, what is man? There is only an indirect answer. Now he's taking this from Cassirer, not directly from Plato. Man is declared to be that creature who's constantly in search of himself, a creature who in every moment of his existence must examine and scrutinize the conditions of his existence. And then here we get the quote, he is a being in search of meaning. So we have a rather existentialist Plato here, which is to say, not the Plato that we know from his actual texts. This is another common one that you see floating around quite a bit. Atheism is a disease of the soul before it becomes an error of the understanding. And this is coming from what we could call a mistaken attribution, a summary that's being given of what Plato's supposed to be saying, but not actually coming from Plato's text. And it's attributed to Plato's Laws by this author, William Fleming. And then it gets quoted by somebody else who's taking William Fleming at his word in prose quotations from Socrates to Macaulay by Samuel Austin Allibone. So Fleming is claiming that this is what Plato says in the Laws, and you can't really find anything corresponding directly to this in it. So it seems to be Fleming's misremembering or misattribution that gets this going, and this becomes a real darling among conservatives. You can find it, for example, in Conservapedia and in other places where it's being regurgitated. If you know your ancient philosophy well, then as soon as you see this, you're most likely going to say, no, that's not Plato. That's actually clearly Aristotle. Although it's not actually what Aristotle says, and it's kind of a weird translation as well, and so we'll see why in just a minute. So excellence is not a gift, but a skill that takes practice. We do not act rightly because we are excellent. In fact, we achieve excellence by acting rightly. Now, if you know your Greek, you would say, okay, excellence, virtue, arete, great, that's fine. A skill, well, that sounds like techne, and that's not something that Plato or Aristotle actually say. Takes practice, okay, that kind of fits this. We do not act rightly because we are excellent. We achieve excellence by acting rightly. That's a little bit fishy as well. It's hard to pin down exactly where it's going to come from. It doesn't come from Plato. This comes clearly from Aristotle, but where is it coming from? Will Durant, where so many other fake quotes end up coming from. Will Durant didn't ever find a thought that he couldn't paraphrase himself into a catchy thing that then other people would say, oh, well, that must be what indeed Schopenhauer or Bergson, or in this case, Plato, or actually Aristotle, said. So this is not entirely off, but it's definitely not by Plato, and it's not actually by Aristotle either. Everybody's heard this one. Necessity is the mother of invention, and it's not completely off base. It is the result of Benjamin Jowett, a great commentator and translator, but sometimes a little bit too taking liberties in his translations. So, he translates this passage from Plato's Republic, Book 2 as the true creator is necessity, who is the mother of our invention. And this is a little bit periphrastic, meaning that things are being introduced here that are not there in the actual text. Jowett actually does give a better translation at another point, saying our need will be the real creator. So no, mother there, and no invention either. So, this is an interesting quote, not by Plato, but it's deriving from a matrix of garbling things up and adding a few things in. Here's our last fake quote, and this is fake in a couple different ways. It is kind of connected to Plato, and if you know enough about Plato's anthropology and about the terminology that he uses and that translators have employed to render some of the things that he's saying, this can make sense. But you wouldn't catch Plato saying human behavior, right? Human actions, choices, lives, those things would make sense. Human behavior is a weird translation. And saying that it flows from three main sources, you can understand where this is coming from, but this is kind of a garbling up of things. Desire, emotion, and knowledge. Now, why is this off? Emotion is actually a terrible translation of thumos, which is often translated as anger, the spirited part of the soul. Another beautiful translation, the incandescent part of the soul, which you can find in the Philokalia. It's not emotion, although that is probably there because somebody translates the passionate, thumatic part of the soul, or passion itself, as emotion, wrongly. Desire, so Plato thought that we have all sorts of desires, plural, and you can talk about it in the singular as well. This is epithumia, desires for food, for sex, for all these sorts of bodily pleasures, right? So that is indeed something that people are driven by in the Republic. And then knowledge, episteme in Greek, no, it's not actually what human behavior is flowing from, more reasoning or the rational part. And you can take all three of these together, as the parts that Plato is actually talking about in his text. But this is really, what should we say? This is a hot mess of a rendering. I won't even call it a translation. It's sort of a bad summary that somebody came up with of Plato's doctrine. And I think if we did enough searching, we could probably track down the original of it. And it's not totally wrong, right? It does connect up with some things that Plato is saying, but boy, is this misleading. So that is definitely a fake quote. What can you do in order to avoid resharing fake quotes? Because nobody out there, I hope, is going to deliberately create fake quotes. But what can you do as a responsible member of whatever we're going to call the current internet regime that we live under, the new Republic of Letters? Well, the first thing is anytime that somebody quotes something and they don't give you the source text, you should, in fact, exercise healthy suspicion, especially if you know something about the author and this sounds like it doesn't quite fit what you do know about the author. Be suspicious. If you know that something is a fake quote, or even if you suspect that it's a fake quote, don't repost it, because you're just adding to the already too many fake quotes that are out there, drowning out the real things that are being said by these people, and you're becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. When somebody quotes something, don't be afraid to ask them, where did that person say that? Because if they actually know, they'll be happy to tell you. And if they don't know, it's quite likely because it's a fake quote. And it's a good way to find out when you should exercise this suspicion. I'd also like to single out a website that I think is particularly helpful, Sententiae Antiquae, which you can go to and check out. You'll find the link to it in the video description below. And that wraps up this first installation of fake quotes wrongly attributed to Plato.